Each year, many people across the UK are influenced by sport coaches. Many of those people are children, and therefore youth sport needs to be continuously developed and improved by the sport coaches. One coaching method which many sport coaches use is deliberate practice. This coaching method has many pros and cons. In today's episode of the Coaching Podcast, we're going to take a look at that and see when and when not it should be used. I'd like to talk a little bit about the environment I'm in right now, a multi-sport arena where children can play football, basketball, handball, pretty much at the same time. They can use their imagination to create their own games, improving all aspects of their fundamental skills. If we look at Brazilian athletes, for example, the men's football team, many of these boys or men, they grow up in favelas, poor conditions where something like this is all they have. But fundamentally, they're the best footballers out there. They're agile, they're coordinated, and they're always balanced. They have flair that no other country seems to have. You could argue that deliberate practice is something that is introduced later on over there, maybe in an academy, maybe in a school. But as children, they're not forced to play football in a specific way, which is why they're so creative. So what actually is deliberate practice? What's the history behind it, and what is it used for?
Originally, deliberate practice was used as a way for musicians to master a skill and become better overall musicians in their own performance. However, Ericsson et al. In 1993 argued that talent was not an underlying attribute to mastering a skill. In fact, it was the type of practice and the amount of practice devoted to different activities to help them master a specific skill.
However, Ericsson et al. In 1993 indicated that deliberate practice applies to the acquisition of expertise in all human endeavour. One definition of deliberate practice is simply just structured activity aiming to improve overall performance. This consists of specific tasks aiming to tackle weaknesses or a weakness area within your sport to make it a strength and finally improve the overall performance. These tasks do need a lot of effort, they take time, it's not a quick fix, but if athletes build a relationship with deliberate practice, they're very likely to improve their overall performance. So in today's podcast, we are going to look at deliberate practice and why maybe it is a good model and maybe it isn't a good model for coaching, especially in youth sport. For example, motivation is a big constraint that is put on deliberate practice because it's a time-taking process. It's not a quick fix, and athletes need to learn that it's a long process. You have to work with it. So motivation is something that needs to be there throughout. And in youth sport, a lot of motivation comes from parents. And when parents aren't there anymore as children get older, they have to find it themselves. Therefore, we need to look at when deliberate practice is appropriate. Let's dive a little bit deeper in the reality of this literature. We're going to head over to the studio where we've got Nick for an interview. He's going to talk to us a little bit about deliberate practice in youth sport and also on the gym floor with his own clients as he is a strength and conditioning coach. Nick, thank you for joining me. As you know, my name's Max. I'm a student at Sheffield Hallam University. Would it be all right if I ask you a couple of questions?
Of course, mate, yeah.
Perfect. Before we start, we're going to talk a little bit about deliberate practice, but could you just talk a bit about your profession and what you do for me, please?
So I'm a strength conditioning coach and ex-military.
Yeah.
I've done an undergrad in sports science and I've done a master's in strength conditioning, and I currently do a lot of S&C coaching around the local area.
Right, so have you ever heard of the term deliberate practice?
Yeah.
It's a highly effortful, structured way of coaching. It's got a very clear goal in what it's trying to achieve. It's trying to help people improve in their own sport, in their own performance. With that, it comes with a lot of feedback, repetition. And I was wondering if in your own workplace, have you used this as a coaching method and how's it worked for you?
So in terms of a day-to-day practice, as an S&C coach, when we're on the doing strength training, especially on the gym floor, if I get a new member that's coming in and coaching, we tend to do a lot of mechanic work. So as you say, deliberate practice, my philosophy is to keep that load off them within reason before they can move correctly, and then we can load them up safely. That's the main practice that I sort of go through at the moment. If somebody's got a impairment, maybe they have an injury or something like that, then we would look at trying to adapt things to make sure that they get good movement pattern throughout their practice of that exercise.
Do you feel like within that you're giving a lot of feedback and there's time where the participant or the athlete is not on the task. So there'll be a moment where they're working, and then a minute where you're giving them feedback and they're off task. Do you find that works well?
That for me is better.
Yeah.
You might find a lot of coaches, it's not for me, is they'll start giving feedback as the individual is doing the exercise. For me, I'd rather let them do the exercise, they finish, and then they've got the full attention of me as I'm giving the feedback. So for me, I'll give one or two cues or movements to try and sort of change each time. And if they don't master that first two, I'll just stick with that two, because I find that if you overload someone, the mind is just can't deal with it. So it's just little things as we go through the actual session.
Do you feel like that works well with participants or clients that come in where their fundamentals aren't very much there? They're kind of from scratch going into the gym. Do you find that you need to coach in a different way? Or
if someone's new coming in, I'll just let them do it. Because it'll be highlighting their sort of, rather keep it nice and simple, do the exercise where they fall in short. If you get someone so new to say this is the key points, they probably don't understand what you're talking about. And I keep it so let's for example, let's say a deadlift. Okay, I just want you to keep your back straight, and I want you to pick that weight up, or I want you to pick that dumbbell up. Nice and simple. Push up the floor away. Nice and simple. They can do that. Then I can look at the biomechanics and then change it from there.
I suppose letting them do it themselves as well, they can identify where they're going wrong when you give them feedback, because they've done it themselves already and they've explored.
There is a skill acquisition that we look at, and we let them learn by themselves by trying. So I think it's called a track to well. So they can learn that, and they self-organise in that way. So you may think, oh, that's a little bit of an issue. Right? What I want you to do is use this, and then they'll self-organise again. So it is cues to allow them, rather than being very specific in that mechanics.
With adults, it works well because they know what they want to achieve, or they've got an idea of where they want to go. But there's a stat where using deliberate practice, it's only 25 to 52% where in the activity the participants are actually on task. So like you said, you're giving them feedback. There's times where they're not working in a different environment. So let's go to youth sport. Would you say that coaching method is just as effective, or are children likely to not enjoy it because they're not always on task? There's a lot of feedback and correction.
It is very difficult with that. It is very difficult. With my experience working in professional football, they want to kick the ball. And when you're talking to them and saying, right, this is what we're going to do for the first part of the session, their mind is, I want to kick that ball, regardless of age. So from my experience, I tend to remove the balls, so I've got full attention, and they can get the mechanics right before adding the ball. I know that when they go into the session with the main coach, they're going to be kicking the ball all over the place. Let's remove that ball. Let's get some good mechanics. I can try and correct them as best you can, which is quite difficult. And then when they got the ball, again, we go back to that attractor wells. If they're moving without the ball well, they will go to a default movement pattern when they're doing it with the ball. So that's the sort of my philosophy around it.
That makes sense. In academy football then, or professional football, I don't know what it's like compared to your typical Sunday league or normal youth teams, but is there much of a dropout because of the difference in coaching? Did you see many players drop out because of how intense it was, or
no, not all. No, I think they seem to enjoy it. The risk that I found, and we found as staff, is when we broke up for the season, we'd have a lot of parents coming to us and saying, right. What they've got to do off season.
With what you just said there, do you think it's important that children do play multiple sports?
Definitely,
rather than being sport specific in one?
And I think we that's what we always we're going to let them play rugby. Let them run on the streets. Let them get on a bike. You know, let them go and do something different that's got a little bit of cardiovascular in the back. It's got some strength in the background that they don't know about, like getting on a bike or whatever. And other movement patterns, we've seen it with S&C coaches coming from rugby to football. They see things in a different perspective. They'll see different movement patterns, and then they're a little bit more, easier to sort of move from different things. So I think that is a better option. People worried about doing resistance training as well, so we can get that carryover. So when we say resistance training, we're using resistance. We're not. People think, oh, you shouldn't be putting weights on the back. We're not saying that. If I'm asking a guy to do 5 squats, or a young boy to do 5 squats, he's using his body weight as resistance, but he's creating a movement pattern. We're creating default settings and movement patterns. We haven't got to overload them. It might be a power bag. It might be something like a football or whatever it is. And all we're doing is we're creating that resistance training. But at the same time, they were creating good habits when it can transfer onto the pitch.
I think it makes sense to lay a good foundation down early on, so that later on they can then go into that specialisation. Would you say that deliberate practice is something that should be introduced later on and they should master the foundations first, or can it be done at the same time?
I think it can do it at the same time. My philosophy would be get the basics right.
Yeah.
And once you've got the basics right, it's like a foundation on a house. If you get the foundations right, everything on top of that is going to be solid.
Yeah.
For me, if you get a good movement pattern, when you're doing a 90 degree or 180 degree agility turn, and they haven't got the strength to keep that knee in a good position, then we increase the risk of injury, etc., and all that good stuff. So I think them fundamentals, and then when they go onto the pitch, it just becomes the norm.
Yeah.
So that's my sort of philosophy.
So I would like to conclude this podcast with my opinion on this matter. I think deliberate practice is a great coaching method. Not necessarily the only method a coach should be using in youth sport, but I think it can definitely be done to sort of enhance sport-specific skills. And I think that's something that has to come at some point in an athlete's development across a sport. I would encourage children to play multiple sports.
In multiple sports, I do think the coaches need to prioritise a bit of deliberate play in youth sport due to the fact that children need to be motivated to come back to training sessions if they know they can explore and learn with their own ideas. The same way, like I said at the start, the Brazilian footballers, when they were younger, they probably had that chance to create their own ideas, their own skills, and then apply it in the future with correct skill.
The only problem with deliberate practice is that it's a long process, and maybe it does need to be introduced.